Hello, welcome back to Life on the Fringe. Today we are going to be talking about critical race theory, or CRT. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the bans that are being passed in various states, the bans that are up for vote, and the ones that have already passed, and kind of exploring what those bans mean for education going forward, what are the consequences, and what are the unintended consequences of those bans. I'm going to give a brief definition of what CRT is, but for the most part, I'm going to be talking about the ramifications of the laws, and in a separate video, I'll kind of talk about what CRT would look like in schools and the potential benefits to CRT, as well as some of the negatives that people see in CRT being in schools. But this video is mostly going to be talking about the laws themselves and the consequences of the laws. For context, my area of study is free speech in schools. My undergraduate thesis was on student speech in schools, and my master's thesis is on teacher speech and political disclosure in schools, K-12. My undergraduate degree is in political science with a concentration in American politics with a minor in urban education policy, and my master's degree that I'm currently working on is in urban education policy. So this is of great interest to me. It has a lot of implications for my research, and additionally it's led to a lot of kind of lively discussion about education and what should be taught in schools. So I think this is a great starting point for people to be interested in what I consider to be one of the most important topics, educating the youth. Unfortunately, like with most things, it has become a very polarized topic. So I want to give us a little bit of an entry point so we can all be on the same page and talk about what CRT actually is and what the definition of it is and what it is not. And then we'll get to the bans. So the definition I'm going to be using for CRT is from an article by Adrienne D. Dixon, What's Going On, A Critical Race Theory Perspective on Black Lives Matter and Activism in Education. What is CRT? Quote, CRT emerged as a response to the limitations of the class-only analysis by critical legal scholars who engaged a Marxist critique of U.S. jurisprudence. While not abandoning class as an explanatory factor, CRT scholars believed that the law played a specific role in reifying and was often responsible for racial subordination and inequity. In education and following their colleagues in legal scholarship, Latson, Billings, and Tate's 1995 argued that education policies and practices in the United States often contributed to inequitable educational outcomes for students of color and was a logical consequence of a larger inequitable social and political system that is premised on the subordination of people of color and people who live in poverty. Moreover, they argued that race was under-theorized in education. 20 years later, Latson, Billings, and Tate's initial publication on CRT in education. CRT has emerged as a full-fledged subfield in education that has drawn on and extended the CRT legal scholarship. End quote. So, to summarize, CRT is a field of study in education and also law, but for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to talk about it as a framework for education research that focuses on the ways that laws and institutions have led to inequitable outcomes for students of color. So it isn't a curriculum that you can teach necessarily. It's a field of study. So topics in CRT that you might see in college, for example, and in master's programs, like the ones I have taken, have focused on the ways that housing opportunities have led to a wealth gap that we still see today. So in the past, for example, people of color could not get quality loans and the same type of loans for the same rates as white families. And this would lead to disparate outcomes in housing ownership, home ownership, that have had long-term ramifications that we still see today. Because it isn't a curriculum that teachers, like for example, unlike a comparison would be the 1619 project. So the 1619 project was an issue of the New York Times that it was a series of essays and photo essays, videos, interviews, all on one site, and teachers could go to that site and then maybe assign something from that site to talk about in schools. In addition, the New York Times worked with the Pulitzer Center to create lesson plans that teachers could take right from the Pulitzer Center, and it would link to the 1619 project. So if you banned something like the 1619 project, it would be clear what you're banning. You wouldn't have, any assignments that reference the 1619 project, or you wouldn't use the lesson plans that have been created for the 1619 project, and it would be fairly contained because the 1619 project is a defined work that you are not then including in schools. But when you ban something as broad as critical race theory, that's not a textbook that you can just say we're not teaching that. It's not a pamphlet, it's not a video, there's not a specific study. It's an entire body of work, and it's a research framework. So it would be about as complicated as trying to ban something like biology, but then expecting teachers to teach chemistry, and you'd be in all sorts of gray areas where the two overlap. Because it's hard not to teach history and not touch on some topics that CRT has also studied. So we can get into this more once we look at the actual bans that are being passed in the different states. So I'm going to be citing from this article, Where Critical Race Theory is Under Attack by Sarah Schwartz. It was first published in June 11th, 2021, but has been updated as recently as February 24th, 2022. It is updated very frequently, which is great, and it has this very informative graphic. So it tells you where different laws are up for vote. That'd be the yellow boxes. And then the red boxes is where a ban has been voted down, so there is no ban. And the blue boxes are where there is a ban. So blue for ban, yellow for maybe, red for no ban. So we'll start with New Hampshire. So in June 2021, Republican Governor Chris Sununu, I'm horrible at names and I apologize, signed a state budget bill that included language banning teachers from discussing race, gender, and other identity characteristics in certain ways in class. So that's what's already passed. However, there is a 2022 bill proposed by a Democrat that would repeal these bans. And a separate bill in the 2022 session would prohibit teachers from advocating socialism, Marxism, or, quote, any doctrine or theory promoting a negative account or representation of the founding and history of the United States of America, end quote. So let's start with the ban that has already passed. This is very typical of what these bans look like. A ban that, in broad terms, bans teachers from discussing race, gender, and identity characteristics in certain ways in class. I use these broad language because CRT, as I said, is so broad that trying to whittle it down to something more specific is inaccurate to CRT, but the problem is that there's a huge overlap with talking about race, gender, and other identity characteristics that is in a way of CRT and is in a non-CRT way. And these bans make it so that the cautious route is to not talk about them at all. And we've already seen a chilling effect where teachers where these bans have passed want to avoid these topics entirely. The problem is that these topics, like race and gender, already come up in history. So how do you talk about the women's rights movement if we don't talk about gender? There's not a gender-neutral way to discuss the feminist movement in U.S. history and what it achieved in terms of women's voting rights, for example. There's also not a way to talk about U.S. history and not talk about race. There was, not in New Hampshire, but in a different state where a ban was passed, parents that didn't want civil rights heroes to be discussed. They wanted to ban that curriculum. The school district decided not allow the civil rights heroes curriculum, but it was brought forward because this ban encourages parents to not talk about race in schools. Obviously, that would include civil rights heroes. Other states, you have seen this type of ban lead to eliminating discussions of race around slavery. You can't talk about slavery in the United States and not talk about race when it was a race-based institution. So much of American history is colored by racial disparity and racial segregation. And ignoring that basically means it's impossible to teach history. In addition to the negative consequences of not learning the past, it would be an accurate portrait of the present as well. There's this fear that CRT ban proponents have that teaching the United States history the way that it happened will lead people to be unpatriotic. But I think that not teaching U.S. history is counter to the values that the United States has. There's a reason why we value things like the freedom of speech, and one of those reasons is that being able to discuss difficult topics allows us to build a better future, and we have these ideals that as a country that we need to move towards, and the moving towards the American ideals and the American dream is something that we can only achieve if we acknowledge where we have been and where we are currently. Not being able to talk about the negative things that happened at the founding of the United States means that we can't talk about the way that slaves were used in the Revolutionary War. It means that we can't talk about the fact that the Constitution contains a huge compromise around slavery and the value of black people's lives. The Constitution, at the writing of the Constitution, there was a huge debate whether or not we would be a free nation from the beginning or not, and we ended up including to have slavery. That was a compromise that the states made in order to get all the states to vote and sign on for the Constitution. Ignoring that we valued unifying over slavery really eliminates pivotal pieces of history that have huge impacts. So, for example, we didn't outlaw slavery, and we put in the 3/5 clause that counted black people as 3/5 of a person for the census. And we also had laws in place that prevented slaves from getting to freedom and not being, able to be brought back to slavery. Obviously, that impacted how long slavery went on for, and impacted the Civil War, and impacted the abolitionist movement. These are things that students should know and grapple with. Again, wishing that history was different does not make it true. And I don't think that people love the United States because they just can't get enough of George Washington. I think people are patriotic and love the United States for the idea of the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, where everyone is created equal. That's an aspirational goal that was not realized at the founding, and I think that's important for students to see, And it goes beyond the founding, so it's not just preserving the founding fathers, but the history of the United States of America. I would say any depiction of slavery could be considered a negative account of the history of the United States of America. Anything talking about Jim Crow would be a negative account of the history of the United States of America. Are we not supposed to teach Jim Crow? Are we not supposed to teach about segregation? Are we not supposed to teach about Brown v. Board? Are we not supposed to teach about white flight and the busing question? Are we not supposed to teach about Japanese internment camps during World War II? Every country's history has negative things and positive things, and only teaching about the positive things does not prepare students for dealing with problems in the real world. And it's important to remember that students in high school, there are 18, vote, or they vote immediately upon graduation. It's not like they don't have to make political decisions while they're in high school. Signing up for the military is something that you can do in high school, whether or not you join JROTC. Students are making political choices all the time in schools that affect the world, and it's important that we give them an accurate picture of what happened. And that doesn't mean that you need to teach CRT, but it does mean that these bans that prevent any discussion of negative accounts or representation of the founding or history of the United States of America prevent that from happening. In Florida, in December 2021, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis announced that Stop Wrongs Against Our Kids and Employees Act, or the Stop Woke Act, which would prevent K-12 schools from using state funding to hire consultants that adhere to critical race theory, and would give parents, quote, private right of action, end quote, to sue if they believe their children were being taught the theory. So, this type of ban, and Florida's not the only one to allow this private right of action, creates an additional problem. So you have parents who are getting homework back. The way that CRT has been described in these bans is as broad as we're not going to talk about race in schools. So a student comes home with something very typical of, say, the civil rights movement, and it's talking about Rosa Parks and the bus, or it's talking about the I Have a Dream speech, or maybe it's talking about the Black Panthers. The parent may see that it's about race, and it's talking about the civil rights movement and maybe the Black Panthers, and having you question the benefits and the consequences of the different types of protest that the Black Panthers and Martin Luther King had. Parents could see that as a discussion of race and choose to sue the school. Now, you may be thinking, oh, this is ridiculous. You have to remember that America is a very sue-friendly country. So if people can sue, they tend to sue. And allowing parents to sue as individuals is incentivizing parents to be incredibly liberal with how they apply this ban, in the sense that they will try to apply this ban as broadly as possible so they can sue. And in addition to having a chilling effect and teachers not covering topics as important as the civil rights movement that all bans has, it also puts a strain on the legal system. Parents will sue, the school is tied up in legal complications, the school then has to change whatever they're doing, take a pause, but then you have the court system being tied up with all of these different court cases trying to apply a very broad ban, and it's going to lead to some constitutional issues as well, especially when it comes to teacher political disclosure. So it's just setting us up for a huge amount of court cases that are going to be expensive to the United States and the tax base over something that's just a very poorly written law. And especially when parents aren't aware of what constitutes CRT, you end up having way too many lawsuits than are necessary. I should also mention that Florida has a Don't Say Gay campaign going on, which is protesting the Stop Woke Act. The Stop Woke Act basically makes it almost impossible for teachers to talk about LGBTQ plus issues at all. Which again, it's weird to ban a topic from history. The way that gay marriage was legalized in the US is an incredibly useful topic for students because it exemplifies how states can legalize something without the federal government legalizing it, and the way that states took different paths to legalization, so whether that be by referendum or by a federal court case or by a change to the state constitution. Those are the gay rights movement is a very good case for students to study the institutions of the United States. And even if you don't agree with gay marriage, for example, just because you don't agree with it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. So not being able to teach it makes no sense. Anyhow, the Don't Say Gay bill the Don't Say Gay movement in Florida highlights one of the limitations to these bans, which is completely erasing LGBTQ plus history from schools and LGBTQ plus teachers from the workforce. The proposed bill for 2022 that prohibits any negative account or representation of the founding of the history of the United States of America, that type of ban does a disservice to students and to the progress that the United States has made towards equity. One bill that's up for vote in Indiana says that would require schools to teach that, quote, socialism, Marxism, communism, totalitarianism, or similar political systems are incompatible with and in conflict with the principles of freedom upon which the United States was founded, end quote. So this type of ban may seem slightly more specific, but again, who defines what is socialism? Especially when socialist Democrats are a rising component of the left. This moves schools from being a politically neutral space to a politically charged space. In my opinion, bans like this actually do more indoctrination than not having the ban at all. It's also important to note that we have had this argument about whether or not to include these topics in the past, and I'm going to get more into whether or not we should teach about and how to teach about these topics in my next video, but it is something I wanted to mention, that this is something that we have seen in the past, and in the past when we have banned topics like communism. It has led to Red Scares in the United States, where teachers were fired for absolutely anything. Teachers that were very anti-communist got fired for being communist because of bans like this. It's just important to realize that putting something like this into law may not have the intended effect that it's trying to have. The last thing I want to say in this video about the effects of these bans is the lesson that it's teaching students. So there are two types of lessons in schools. There's the explicit lesson and the implicit lesson. The explicit lesson is what students hear. It's what's in the textbook. It's what the teacher says. It's what the posters on the wall say. It's the intended lesson that the teacher has. The implicit lesson is what the student gains, things that aren't necessarily said out loud, but the way that the situation is structured, what isn't said, and what it teaches. And by not teaching the negative history of the United States and the negative aspects of things that happened in the United States, it teaches students that those things aren't important. For students of color, it's basically saying what happened in the past isn't important. It should be gotten over, it should be moved forward. It's so unimportant we don't even want to talk about it. And that can be very dismissive of the experiences of students of color today, and their families, and their histories. And it teaches white students that it's not their issue, they don't need to learn about it, they don't need to study it, it's something that they don't need to think about. And we know that these issues remain a problem in the United States. Political polarization remains a problem. Disparity in educational opportunities and outcomes remain a problem in the United States. And it's going to take a coalition to fix and address those problems. It seems to me that these bans value the discomfort of white students over the reality of people of color. Being uncomfortable with discussing race does not mean it's not an important discussion to have. Being uncomfortable with the fact that the United States has a very racist history, and it's pretty recent as well, especially when we talk about the civil rights movement, doesn't mean it didn't happen, it doesn't mean we shouldn't study it. When we learn, we are uncomfortable. Even with something as apolitical as a basic arithmetic lesson, when you're learning it, it's hard, it's uncomfortable, there's feelings of inadequacy and failure. But as you do the math problem, as you practice over and over, you get more comfortable talking about math and doing the math problem. The same is true for learning about the negative history of the United States. It doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about the good things or the progress that's happened, but talking about race as a whole is something that makes people uncomfortable, and we need to practice talking about race so we can address problems around race in the future, in the present. Practice makes perfect. It might be uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean it's not important. And frankly, the comfort of students is not, of white students, shouldn't be valued more than the importance of learning American history. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you have questions or comments, leave them down below, and if I see them before the next video, I will respond to them in that video. So leave those down here. I will also link all of the resources that I have down below. Check out that map for yourself. As you saw, there are so many states that are in the process of passing bills, some even where they've already passed. So check out your state and call your senator or representative to get involved. You can have a say on these issues. The map is down below. And finally, if you want to see more of our content and that next video, click subscribe, ding the bell button to know when we post, and most importantly, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!